Welcome, everyone. This is Chuck Jaffe. At HL7 International, which is a global community of contributors, we've participated in the 10-year journey that's resulted in the publication of Fire Release 4. In the last year, the staff at ONC and CMS have spent countless hours developing the final rules that we'll be discussing today. However, in the last 4 months, the world has encountered a pandemic that exceeds the proportions and perhaps the devastation that we've not seen in 100 years. All of us have been committed to developing and enabling the capabilities to bring data and knowledge that will combat that pandemic. And for that, I thank you. In the last year, many of the members of the Fire Accelerator program, including the Argonaut and Da Vinci projects, have greatly contributed to this effort. During this webinar, we will share the experience of recognized domain experts who will provide the groundwork for understanding the rules first published last month. Our ability to bring these rules into perspective and to implement them in the coming years will be a measure of our commitments to our health systems, to the clinical and research communities, and ultimately to the patients whom we serve. Thanks for attending this webinar. All of us welcome your input. And I'd like to turn over to Jamie Ferguson from Kaiser Permanente and the chair of the HL7 Policy Committee, who will introduce the panelists. Thanks to everyone, and thank you, Jamie.
Now, turning to the introduction of the speakers, if I could have the next slide, please. Our speakers today wear many different hats and have illustrious careers. So for me to give each of them a full introduction would simply take too long. So I'll just mention very quickly their HL7 affiliations, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Suarez. Walter is, of course, the chair of the HL7 Board of Directors currently. He also sits on the executive committee of the Gravity Project, as well as the Policy Advisory Committee. Mark Siegel is the previous chair of the Policy Committee and a current member of the Policy Committee. Craig is a co-chair of the Public Health Committee. Kathleen is a co-chair of both the Security and Financial Management working groups, as well as a member of the Policy Committee. And Hans is a co-chair of the Orders and Observations working group, as well as a member of the Policy Committee. And I want to thank Tisha for her great support in putting this whole webinar together. And without further ado, Walter, I'll hand it over to you to begin the presentations.
All right. Thank you. If you could go to the first slide, please. While these final rules aren't specifically geared towards public health, there are several points of interaction with the public health community. In relationship to the ONC final rules on information blocking, as Walter and Mark has mentioned previously, the final rule did consolidate and clarify the definitions of HIE and HIN, but there still may be some ambiguity about whether or not certain public health programs, such as immunization registries, which both collect and disseminate data, could fall under the umbrella of the information blocking. Some clarification on this, which we've requested, is going to be important to the community to know exactly where they stand for some of these requirements. Now, fortunately, the rule is actually much clearer in terms of defining the placement of community-based providers and organizations with respect to information blocking. And the general concept there is that these community-based organizations wouldn't be covered, wouldn't be bound by the information blocking rules, as they're not typically considered providers in the way that some other organizations are. Next slide, please. We've also heard a lot about the standardized FHIR APIs, and the availability of these standardized APIs does open some interesting new potential opportunities for public health programs. FHIR offers new ways for these programs to potentially query for additional data necessary to go beyond just the initial reporting, which is largely what's in place now. And this can be important for public health follow-up activities and analysis. And there are many different places that this may come into play for a public health program, but the important thing that we need to keep in mind is that there are some important and complex issues that are going to need to be worked out regarding security and the right to access data and other places that will need to be worked out before the APIs can be used, and that we must consider the use of these FHIR APIs within a larger framework of public health reporting, which will provide public health with efficient access to the data that they need while minimizing provider burden and health IT developer work. Next slide, please. Some of the impacts to public health are not directly on the community, but really come indirectly through new requirements for the developers of health IT that public health interacts with. So as mentioned previously, health IT developers now must perform regular real-world testing. And the final rules are actually quite clear that it encourages the participation of public health in these activities. But in the complex landscape of reporting to public health, where there are multiple jurisdictions and many vendors operating at many submitter sites, this could become a significant and unfunded drain on community resources. And there's also always the danger that if public health isn't well integrated into this real-world testing process, that wheels may be reinvented that public health has already had rolling for a while in terms of dealing with their submitters. The rule clarifies that public health is covered by the new protected communication requirements, which is, I think, good news for the community, so that any issues identified with certified technology during the public health onboarding or reporting phases can be openly discussed with the community. We've also heard a little bit about the standards advancement process, which will allow the health IT developers to voluntarily have their products certified to newer approved versions. But again, in the complex landscape where there are multiple different products interacting with a wide number of jurisdictional programs, each of which that update their technology independently and on independent timelines, there's going to be an increased need for communication and cooperation by everyone involved to ensure that all parties are prepared to support any new standards as they emerge and they're adopted. And finally, the adoption of US CDI as the set of data elements may complicate some exchange with data in public health, as not all of the US CDI components can be accepted by all public health programs. And there's already some discussion as to what the requirements mean to public health programs and whether the transmission of the full set of US CDI data elements may be appropriate for all interactions. Next slide, please. The impact of the CMS rule is, in fact, a little bit lighter than the ONC rule, but there's still a lot of opportunity here for the public health community to access new sources of information regarding both patients in the form of the ADT notifications that were mentioned earlier. Now, public health isn't included in the requirements as a recipient of these ADT notifications, but there is some good discussion in the final rules about potentially extending this, the infrastructure created by this requirement to be able to notify public health programs if there's an agreement between submitters and the public health programs. And then there is also information that will be better available about clinicians in terms of directories and digital address sorts of information, which may make it easier for public health to be contacting the clinicians that provide so much of the key data that public health needs. Next slide, please. But probably what most people are interested in at this point in time is really what the final rule means for situations like the ones we find ourselves in today with the pandemic response to COVID-19. And I think the take-home message here really is that the current crisis has really shone a spotlight on the importance of public health access to healthcare data. And it really, I think, is bringing up the need for public health participation and perspective in rulemaking in the future. And that we really need the incentives to implement public health reporting that will be so crucial to responding to future crises. Next slide. And what we've seen really is that a lot of public health is driven at the state level. And it is problematic when the federal agencies and rules like these don't really fully address state law compliance. For example, from the electronic case reporting perspective, which is critical to responses to things like COVID, there's a reliance on ECR being part of the promoting interoperability menu of choices that isn't sufficient for the broad implementation of the standard as we need it. And that there are providers out there that are queued up to implement this, but because it's optional in promoting interoperability and is not explicitly covered in these final rules, there hasn't been consistent implementation of the solutions necessary for providers to onboard and start submitting this data. And if public health reporting is to mature to where we need it to be to address these sorts of crises that we're seeing now, it needs more in terms of recognition and incentives and resources than what's really being provided by these final rules alone. But I think there's a lot of hope within the public health community that what we're seeing now will really make the role of public health front and center in some of these new reporting requirements, be it case reporting, syndromic surveillance, lab test resulting, or any of the interoperability standards that have been developed over the past few years within the community.